Good morning. Once again, I'm going to wait for all of us to get connected before we start in this morning. Looks to me like we're still waiting for our court reporter to connect to audio. So I'm going to wait a little longer because we do need her to be able to hear us. All right, Ms. Gallagher, are you ready for us to go on the record, or do you need a few moments? Ms. Gallagher, can you hear me? I wanted to make sure. Oh, looks like not. Ms. Gallagher, are you ready for us to go on the record?
Yes, I am. Thank you. Oh,
Thank
one
you.
moment, please, actually, one moment.
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you. All right, good morning. It is February 25th, 2025. I am Nicole Kinsey, presiding hearing officer for the Administrative Hearings Office of the State Water Resources Control Board. This is the hearing on the pending petition for assignment of state filed application 25517 and accompanying water right application 25517X01 and the pending request for release from priority of state filed applications 25513, 25514, the unassigned portion of 25517, 22235, 23780, and 23781 in favor of water right application 25517X01 of Sites Project Authority. It is our third day of the rebuttal portion of the hearing. We are conducting this hearing by Zoom teleconference, and it is also being broadcast live on the AHO YouTube channel. The audio and video are being recorded, and we will post files of this recording in the FTP folder for this proceeding. And the YouTube recording will be available on the AHO YouTube webpage. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties today, please send us an email at sites-wr-application@waterboards.ca.gov. Once again, Ms. Mullen will be handling the screen sharing of exhibits and moving along of slides. If you are a witness today, please feel free to ask Ms. Mullen to advance your slides as you move along. And if you are cross-examining a witness today and you would like Ms. Mullen to pull up a particular exhibit, please feel free to ask her directly. We will take breaks per our usual, and we will once again hold a hard stop at 5 p.m., although it does seem like maybe we will wrap up early today. I am not going to call for appearances. We will carry those over from our past couple days of hearing. And then I just want to summarize where I think we are before we get started. My understanding for today is that we will be hearing from panel 6, from the authorities panel 6, rebuttal witnesses. And then I don't think we have anyone else on who's lined up and available as to testify today. So I believe we're going to complete panel 6 and then we'll be done for the day, unless we have a conversation and something else comes up. And then tomorrow we would hear from the witnesses from the Department of Water Resources and state water contractors. So that is my general understanding of where we are. And then and I won't be with you, but we would pick up the following week with the Sites Project Authority Panel 5 and proceed from there. Ms. Mendel-Rice.
Hi, good morning. I just wanted to give an update on Mr. Goshi's schedule and availability. He's available starting at 1 p.m. tomorrow, which I know is probably not ideal since I assume that Mr. Miller's testimony will not take the entire morning. Unfortunately, he has a conflict in the morning that he can't move. But I just wanted to alert that to you in case it makes sense to maybe start a little bit later tomorrow based on other parties' availability of witnesses.
Thank you, Ms. Mendel-Rice. My inclination will be actually just to go, we'd get started in the morning at 9 o'clock per usual, and then we'd have a extra long lunch break if we're so fortunate to get done early. I think we could all use the time. So we'll plan for that unless someone else convinces me otherwise. Are there any other, thank you for that update. Are there
Thank
any
you.
other updates on witness avail? And I would like tomorrow, before we break tomorrow, I would like to talk about the order of witnesses from the protestants. So and the order of your witnesses and also the order of the parties that you plan to go and present the witnesses, just so we all have a sense of how that will go the following week. But I don't think we need to do that now. Are there any other comments on our schedule for today and tomorrow? All right, then let's go ahead and get started with panel 6, and I will look to whichever of Mr. Ferguson. It looks like you're off mute. Oh, Mr. Schutz, did you have a comment?
I did, and it's a question. It might be a good idea to get a sense of how long people are thinking the panel 5 will take on our next meeting day, which I guess is Tuesday of next week. The protestants had planned to discuss our order of presentation actually on Friday. That's our normal get together day to do administrative kinds of things. And if we had a sense of sort of what the likely time that we'd be looking at when we might start next week, that would give us a better sense of how to sequence our witnesses.
Yes, let's see. Well, I don't know if maybe I'll look at, well, you can start. Do you know how much time you think you might take?
I don't know. Mr. Boucher might, but also or Mr. Mooney, but also the Delta parties, if they're going to have cross for those people, it would be a good idea to get a sense of when the NGO combined groups might start.
Right. Mr. Busher or Mr. Mooney?
I would estimate probably 45 minutes or so. So,
all right, thanks. And Mr. Busher?
So I don't expect to have significant additional time for the terrestrial witnesses panel. I think Mr. Mooney will go first there. Just logistically, we're having a hard time filling up 3 full days next week of our witnesses because several people had planned to do other things on the 6th before that was scheduled, and those other days were half days. We had thought we would probably start the following week. We're gonna keep working on that this morning, but it sounds like the protestant witnesses are gonna start in the morning of the 4th. Is that a fair assumption?
No, because we're going to be, well, maybe. It depends how quickly panel 5 moves, I guess. We have to get through panel 5 first, right? And I won't be there, but on March 4th.
I kind of suspect panel 5 is going to be because there hasn't been a lot of other cross on the wildlife other than myself. So I suspect we're going to be done with them by 11 o'clock.
Yeah.
Then in that case, you're correct. Then we would start with the protestants' witnesses that morning.
So, all right, we'll keep working on that today, and I'll try and get an update at the end of the day today or first thing tomorrow morning back to the group.
Unless it makes sense, and I don't mean to throw. I know everyone has challenges with witness availability, or I would imagine, but I don't know, Mr. Reese, if the Delta parties, that's another possibility, is to reorder the witnesses. We also have Mr. King, who has testimony. So we could do some reordering of that.
Yes, with regard to, yeah, cross of panel 5, we don't have, I don't have any cross for panel 5. Miss Missouri might have some. I don't know if she's on yet. But yeah, as far as reordering going into next week, the 4th, yeah, like I indicated yesterday, that we could do that. Actually, our modelers and technical people are good. We just are missing one witness. Miss Dr. Miles Linefielder will not be available until the 5th of March, but our other witnesses are available on the 4th.
So that seems like it would be an excellent possibility. Are there any objections to having the Delta parties proceed with their rebuttal case starting after the completion of the authorities' rebuttal on March 4th, finishing on March 5th, probably, and then going to the coordinating NGO parties? Are there any objections to that ordering? Mr. King.
Yeah, so I don't have objection, but my preference is for me to go either the 4th or 5th, if possible. My son is come from Germany, and it's his birthday on the 6th, and my sister-in-law is going to be here also. So, if possible, I'd like to do my my part on the 4th or 5th. I can be flexible on the timing too.
Do you prefer the 4th or 5th or the following week when we have
The
three
following,
hearing
the
days?
following week is fine also.
Okay.
The following week would probably be even better, I guess, but it doesn't, it's really depends on I think probably on person, what the site's authority, what their objections may have. So
Great. Thank you.
if I could not do the 6th, that'd be great. I appreciate it.
Yes, understood. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. King.
Oh, and I'll have no questions for panel 5.
Thank
I
you.
may have some questions today, but I'm not sure yet.
Then
So-
with that, let's plan on that the South Delta part, we will proceed on March 4th. We'll start with panel 5 from the authority, and then we'll pick up with one of the two available witnesses on the remaining of March 4th, and then the final South Delta witness on March 5th, and then proceed with the coordinating NGO parties.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you all for your flexibility and working through that.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
With that, are we ready to move to panel 6? I believe Mr. Ferguson.
Yes, we are.
Great. And we have, which of your witnesses will be summarizing direct testimony first?
We're going to go with Kyle Winslow first, and then Ann Huber, and Lisa Aricius is joining us, and she's going to authenticate her testimony, but she won't have a summary presentation.
Sir, Mr. Ferguson, I didn't catch that last name for Lisa.
Yeah, it's Lisa Aricius.
Could you spell that, please?
Yeah, Erecius.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Then we'll start with Dr. Winslow. If you would, please raise your right hand. Welcome, good morning. Please raise your right hand. Dr. Winslow, do you swear or affirm under the penalty of perjury that the testimony you will give in this hearing will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you very much, and you may proceed.
Dr. Winslow, can you please state your full name for the record?
It's Kyle Thomas Winslow.
And you understand you're presenting your testimony this morning under oath, correct? I'm having a bit of trouble hearing you, Dr. Winslow. Can you? Okay, let's try. Is Exhibit Sites 407 an accurate statement of your written rebuttal testimony?
Yes.
And did you prepare that written rebuttal testimony?
Yes, I did.
And is Exhibit Sites 257 an accurate statement of your qualifications?
Yes.
Does Sites Exhibit 408 contain a summary presentation of your written rebuttal testimony?
Yes, it does.
Great. Can you please proceed to summarize your written rebuttal testimony using Cites Exhibit 408?
Yes.
Great. So if we can bring up 408, that'd be, thank you.
Okay, next slide, please, Ms. Mullen. My name is Kyle Winslow. I'm an engineer with Jacobs, a registered professional civil engineer. I have 30 years of experience in Bay Area water resources modeling. And I've had a lead
Sir, I'm going to ask you to slow down, please. We're on Zoom. I'm trying to get every word. If you could please, especially while you're reading, speak a little more slowly. Thank you.
I've had a lead technical role in the Cites Reservoir project since 2019. I led the development and application of the C-Equal W2 reservoir model for Cites, and I'll be testifying on that model today. Next slide, please. My rebuttal testimony focuses on the impacts of considering temperature changes during transit between the Sacramento River intakes and Cites Reservoir. This testimony was done to address an issue raised by Eli Asarian and Jacob Kahn in their original July 2024 testimony. The simulations I will discuss today focus on comparing results from those presented in the FEIR EIS to revised results that were conducted to address this issue raised by Mr. Asarian. On average, we will see negligible changes in Cites release temperature and negligible changes in the Sacramento River temperature after we've accounted for this difference in temperature in the water that is used to fill Cites Reservoir. Now, there will be days when the releases from Cites are considerably warmer, but these are offset by more days when releases are considerably cooler. So on average, we will see effectively no difference in the results from those presented in the FEIR EIS. Next slide, please. So my modeling analysis started with the 2023 Alternative 3 simulation. That simulation has a daily time series of temperatures that are assigned to the inflows into Cites Reservoir. Mr. Asarian noted in his testimony that we didn't account for any changes in that temperature during the travel time between the Sacramento River and Cites Reservoir. On the bottom right of the slide, there is a table that shows how much the temperature in the canals leading to Cites from the river are expected to change, and they're tabulated in degrees Fahrenheit per mile. So in March, for example, the temperature should warm by 4/100ths of a degree Fahrenheit per mile as it travels from the Sacramento River to Cites Reservoir. These changes were not included in the original 2023 FEIR EIS analysis. The chart on the top right indicates the fraction of Cites inflow by month. So you see that most of the inflow to the reservoir happens between the months of December and March. There is little to no inflow in the summer months between June and September. If you cross-reference that to the table on the bottom, you see that the largest expected changes of water in the canals during transit occur when there's basically no inflow to the reservoir. In fact, when the reservoir is filling in November, December, and January, there's actually a reduction in the temperature during transit from the river to the reservoir. So accounting for this in the model, we actually see a net reduction in the inflow temperature to Cites Reservoir relative to the results presented in the 2023 FEIR. So we rebuilt the daily inflow time series using the monthly adjustments that are summarized on the lower right, and then reran the simulations, and then analyzed the outflow temperature. And then I also analyzed the river temperature using the blending tool, which I'll discuss. Next slide, please, Ms. Mullins. So on the right, we see a frequency distribution of the daily reservoir release temperature from the water quality model. You see that most of the time there is no change. There are what we call tails on either end. There are some days where the water is significantly warmer, up to say 6 or 7 degrees Fahrenheit, and that is offset by days in which the temperature released from the reservoir is significantly colder, with differences approaching 14 degrees Fahrenheit. But on average, the average daily change of this release water from the reservoir, once we account for temperature changes in the inflow water, is actually negative 0.01 degrees Fahrenheit, so effectively negligible. Next slide, please. We want to focus on the larger days of changes. So I've tabulated in terms of the number of days in the bar chart, how many days in each month during the entire simulation were the changes either larger than 1 degree Fahrenheit as an increase or larger than 1 degree Fahrenheit as a decrease. The blues indicate decreases in temperature and the reds indicate increases in temperature. As I mentioned previously, there are more days where the water is colder, much colder on a release than there are days when the water is much warmer, and that much is tabulated in terms of differences exceeding 1 degree Fahrenheit. So there are more decreases than increases. There's more variability in the summer and fall. So sometimes we have much warmer water, sometimes we have much cooler water being released, and those are the larger bars that we see from, say, July through November. And this difference where we don't have a consistent change it highlights the complexity of the reservoir dynamics. And if you recall from previous testimony, the model is set up to try and meet a target release temperature. And it does that by taking some water out of the surface and some water out of the bottom. And it mixes that in the right ratio to meet the user-defined temperature target for the model. So if the water on the surface is slightly warmer or colder, that just changes the ratio of surface to bottom water that the model pulls under that directive to meet a fixed temperature. So we basically see no change when that temperature target is mandated. All we're seeing is a slight shift in where the water comes from, but the reservoir still has the ability to provide the same amount of water at that target. When that target is not in place in the winter months, we will see that there are slightly warmer temperatures. Next slide, please, Ms. Mullins. Okay, so the bar chart on the right is showing us the seasonality of changes in sites' release water temperature. And we're looking at the average change between the release water temperature once I account for transit changes between the Sacramento River intakes and the reservoir relative to the original results presented in the 2023 EIR. So we see increases in January through May, and then also in December. So this is saying that on average, with this new simulation, we're seeing slightly warmer water released in the winter months and then into the spring. We see decreases, very small decreases in general, between the months of June and November. And this is because, as I mentioned, the model is operating to a user-defined target. And it's saying that basically, even if we account for this temperature change on transit, there's really negligible change in the outflow during those summer months. Now, we should note that there's a seasonality to the releases. And so it's not, you couldn't just average across this bar chart to get an average release difference, because there are far more releases in the summer, obviously, than there are in the winter. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the bar chart on the right is looking at the average site's release water temperature, not looking at changes, but looking at the actual nominal temperature. The blue bars are the results that were presented in the FEIR, EIS, and these are monthly averages. The orange bars are the new values that were recently produced once I account for the transit changes in temperature. So from that bar chart, you can see effectively results that were presented on the previous slide. There are very little changes in the months of, say, May through November. when more of the releases occur and when temperatures are higher, just on seasonality. The largest changes on the previous bar chart were those in January, and you can see the offset there. But I want to point out how cold the average release water temperature is in January. It's about 43 degrees Fahrenheit. So that 0.4 degree Fahrenheit increase in release water in January is negligible in terms of any concerns in the Sacramento River because the water is so cold in those months. Next slide, please. We looked at the reservoir release temperature. Notice that there were no change. We wanted to double check how that filtered through to the changes in temperature in the Sacramento River itself. So I reran the temperature blending tool. This is a tool that Dr. Samana provided testimony on in the original testimony in July, but I have that tool. I provided senior technical oversight on the development of that. I use that tool just to check how things change in the river. Now you can expect if we're bringing out slightly colder water on average, but negligibly different than before, we're probably going to see the same type of thing in the river, and that's what we see. So the monthly average change in the river is actually 0.002 degrees Fahrenheit colder than results presented in the 2023 FEIR EIS. Those changes in my mind are negligible. We present results here on a monthly basis. We don't have a measure of kind of the worst day because the blending tool uses some results from CalSim, which is a monthly time step model. So we can't get into a daily resolution like we could with outflow from sites. So we don't see any big individual differences here. The largest single worst case month that we see is an increase of 0.2 degrees Fahrenheit compared to those results presented in the FEIR EIS. And that single month is an August 1987 month when there was a rapid drawdown into a drought period. Okay, one last slide, please. So just to summarize, this is done on a monthly basis. We did a frequency distribution of changes in each month, and this is looking at changes in the Sacramento River itself. So these are results from the temperature blending tool. If you look at the median line, we only have results presented from April through December because the model does not, or the project does not release water January through March. And all of those medians are 0 or less. So that's saying there is a net decrease in temperature in the Sacramento River once we account for changes in the inflow water to sites. And just to, we also presented the 90th percentile here, and we do see a few months where there is an increase of 0.1 degrees Fahrenheit. I did mention that the single worst month was an increase of 0.2 degrees Fahrenheit. And then just for clarification, we're only looking at months with Dunnigan pipeline releases. You see the number of months in the first line, how many months in our 82-year simulation period when there were actual releases during that month. So all the percentiles are correlated to those number of months. And again, this is the 2023 alternative 3 simulation. Okay, that concludes my testimony.
Thank you, Dr. Winslow. So we'll move on to Ms. Huber and Ms. Aurelius, and I'll start with Ms. Huber.
And I will go ahead. I know you've been with us before, but I will administer the oath. Ms. Huber, will you please raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm under the penalty of perjury that the testimony you will give in this hearing will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I think your audio isn't working. I do. It's still not. We still can't hear you. You're not on mute on the Zoom. It may be your microphone. We still can't hear you. Nope. you may need to check the microphone settings and then there's the other option, which is to leave the Zoom room and come back, which sometimes works. It's still not.
How about now?
There we go. We have you.
Yeah. It's not my standard microphone, so hopefully it will
Understood.
be okay.
Exactly. Have to toggle in. I will go ahead and we'll try the oath again. And let me. And is it Dr. Huber or Ms. Huber?
Ms.
Ms. Okay, I want to make sure I get my titles right. Ms. Huber, please raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm under the penalty of perjury that the testimony you will give in this hearing will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you very much. Please proceed.
All right, Ms. Huber, can you please state your full name for the record?
It's Ann Huber.
And you understand you're presenting your testimony this morning under oath, correct?
Yes.
Is Exhibit Cites 337 an accurate statement of your written rebuttal testimony?
Yes.
And did you prepare that written rebuttal testimony?
Yes.
Do you have any corrections you would like to make to your written rebuttal testimony?
Yes, I do. Two of the exhibits referenced in my testimony were very similar to other documents, and confusion between these files will be rectified by making changes associated with the following two exhibits. For Cites 353, the exhibit is correct, but the citation and page number references for this exhibit need small corrections. And for Cites 355, the exhibit is incorrect and a new version will be submitted. Minor additional corrections will be made to citations in the references section of Cites 337. Also, page numbering in Cites 337 needs to be corrected. Currently, there are 2 page 33s.
Okay, thank you. And Ms. Kinsey, we're in the process of preparing a revised version of that testimony with an errata explaining those revisions.
Thank you.
Ms. Huber, is Exhibit Cites 207 an accurate statement of your qualifications?
Yes, it is.
And does your written rebuttal testimony rely on exhibits that were submitted as part of this rebuttal portion of the hearing?
Yes. Yes, Cites 338 through 339 are the exhibits.
Is it just Cites 338 through 339?
379.
Okay, great.
379.
And did you confirm that the exhibits submitted as Cites 338 through 379 are true and correct copies of the documents referenced in your written testimony?
Yes, with the exception of Cites 355, as I noted earlier.
Okay, great. And does Exhibit Cites 380 contain a summary presentation of your written rebuttal testimony?
Yes.
Okay, great. So we will have you summarize your testimony using that summary presentation after I proceed to have Ms. Auricius authenticate her testimony. So Ms. Auricius, good morning.
Good morning.
And I think, Ms. Auricius, I should administer the oath as well.
Okay.
Thank you. If you would please raise your right hand. Ms. Auricius, do you swear or affirm under the penalty of perjury that the testimony you will give in this hearing will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
Thank you. Please go ahead, Mr. Ferguson.
All right, Ms. Auricius, can you please state your full name for the record?
Lisa Auricius.
Do you understand that you're presenting your testimony under oath?
I do.
And is Exhibit Cites 393 an accurate statement of your written rebuttal testimony?
Yes,
And did you prepare that written rebuttal testimony?
I did.
And is Exhibit Cites 394 an accurate statement of your qualifications?
Yes.
Great, thank you very much. So now we'll return to Ms. Huber and have her summarize her written testimony relying on Cites 380. No, we can't hear you.
Okay, I was just trying something different. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. You can go to the next slide, please, Ms. Mullins. Good morning, everyone. In this presentation, I plan to respond to issues raised by protestants regarding potential harmful algal blooms, or HABs, and cyanotoxins associated with the site's reservoir. This rebuttal testimony supports my opinion that because of the expected low effect of site's reservoir releases on concentrations of cyanobacteria and cyanotoxins in the Sacramento River, and based on research on HABs that already occur in the Delta, operation of site's reservoir is unlikely to cause unreasonable adverse effects in the Sacramento River and Delta associated with cyanobacteria or cyanotoxins. Next slide, please. After an introduction, this presentation includes topics that touch on issues raised by protestants, including nutrients, a comparison to San Luis Reservoir, cyanobacteria and cyanotoxin locations within site's reservoir, effectiveness of HABs management measures in site's reservoir, the effect of changes in delta hydrology on HABs, cyanobacteria inoculum in the delta, and a conclusion. Next slide, please. The material covered in this testimony is based on literature review, data analysis, information from the FEIR, EIS, evaluation of alternative 3, and the site's reservoir management plan, or RMP. The analysis is not based on comparison to regulatory standards because there are currently no federal or state regulatory standards for cyanobacteria or cyanotoxins. And the analysis is not based on modeling of HABs in site's reservoir because accurate HABs modeling may not be possible even if measured data are available for model parameterization. And modeling would be highly speculative for a reservoir that does not yet exist. Next slide, please. First, a very brief summary of background information from the FEIR EIS. Environmental variables conducive to HAB formation include sufficient nutrient concentrations, particularly phosphorus and nitrogen, warm water temperatures, stagnant water, and adequate sunlight. Based on expected nutrients entering site's reservoir, water temperature in the epilimnion, that's at the top of the reservoir. And
I'm sorry, ma'am.
Yeah. Epilimnion, it says
Could you spell that, please?
Yeah.
Yes.
EPILIMNION. And that's the top layer of a reservoir. Based on temperatures in the epilimnion and occurrences of HABs at other reservoirs, HABs could occur at site's reservoir between late spring and fall. Okay, next slide, please. One concern raised by protestants was that nutrient concentrations in site's reservoir would be high enough to cause severe HABs. This seems unlikely for multiple reasons. As shown in the next 3 slides, nitrogen and phosphorus concentrations in water diverted from the Sacramento River to site's reservoir would be substantially lower than at locations where HABs are particularly problematic. If HABs form in site's reservoir, they could deplete nutrients in the epilimnion, and nutrient resupply to the epilimnion from the sediment would be limited due to thermal stratification. My written testimony also considers the ratio of nitrate to total phosphorus to conclude that reductions in either phosphorus or nitrogen concentrations could limit magnitude or duration of HABs. Next slide, please. This graph shows that the concentration of dissolved nitrate in the Sacramento River is less than locations where HABs are problematic. This and the following two figures are box and whisker plots that show minimum and maximum values.
I'm
The
sorry,
whisker-
I'm sorry, ma'am. Are what plots?
Oh, box and whiskers. They show the minimum and maximum values, which are the whiskers, the vertical lines, and 25th percentile and 75th percentile values, the box, with the line in the box representing the median values. The locations include the site's diversion locations on the Sacramento River at Red Bluff and Hamilton City, labeled RB and HC. The Sacramento River at Hood, which is near the downstream end of the Sacramento River. The Klamath River below the site of Iron Gate Dam. The intake to Banks pumping plant in the Delta. The canal below Gianelli pumping plant at San Luis Reservoir, which provides municipal and agricultural water supply for much of the state. And the San Joaquin River at Vernalis. I should clarify that the locations where HABs typically are a concern include the Klamath River, San Luis Reservoir, the Delta, and not the Sacramento River at Hood. That's shown for comparison to the Red Bluff and Hamilton City values. The data were divided into a period with higher concentrations, November through April, and a period with lower concentrations, May through October. The November through April values for Red Bluff and Hamilton City represent concentrations in water potentially that could be diverted to sites reservoir storage. The lower concentrations during May through October are probably partially due to increased phytoplankton growth. Next slide, please. Differences between total phosphorus at Red Bluff and Hamilton City and the other locations are even larger than the nitrate differences. Note that the yellow box is missing for Red Bluff and Hamilton City for May through October. This is because the 25th percentile and median values are equal. This is more likely to occur when there are a lot of low values. Next slide, please. The pattern is similar for dissolved orthophosphate. I guess I don't need to spell that, it's on the graph, which is the most easily utilized form of phosphorus for cyanobacteria. Next slide, please. Another protestant concern was that releases from sites reservoir would cause substantial increases in delta nutrients that could increase HABs in the delta. However, nutrients released from sites reservoir would not cause HABs in the delta for the following reasons summarized here.
Ma'am, I know that you're reading, and when people read, they tend to go pretty fast. That's just natural. If you could please slow down, there's a lot of technical language in here. Thank you.
Okay. Do I need to repeat any part? Or
well, let's see. Nutrients released from sites reservoir would not cause, and then that was where
HABs. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
HABs in the delta for the following reasons summarized here. Under existing conditions, nutrients in the delta are high and do not limit bloom formation. Nutrient concentrations in the Sacramento River would remain low with sites releases and would remain substantially lower than nutrient concentrations in the San Joaquin River. Sites contributions to Sacramento River flow could help dilute nutrients from the San Joaquin River at the time of year when HABs are likely to form. Okay, next slide, please. Another concern raised by protestants was that HABs in sites reservoir would be as bad as in San Luis Reservoir. However, cyanobacteria in sites reservoir are likely to be less problematic than in San Luis Reservoir due to several differences between the two reservoirs. Sites Reservoir would have lower nutrient concentrations. This was indicated in the box and whisker plots shown in previous slides. Sites Reservoir inflow temperatures would be lower than San Luis Reservoir inflow temperatures, which would contribute to colder water in the hypolimnion and more stable reservoir stratification. Sites Reservoir would have stable stratification, unlike San Luis Reservoir. Stratification may be helpful for several reasons. It would allow effective use of the IO tower because it would result in vertical gradients of water quality constituents. It would result in lower water temperature and stagnant conditions deep in the reservoir, which would not be conducive to emergence of cyanobacteria seeds from the sediment, and it would limit the movement of nutrients from the sediment to cyanobacteria in the epilimnion. Next slide, please. Another concern raised by protestants was that high concentrations of cyanobacteria and cyanotoxins would spread throughout Sites Reservoir, causing high concentrations near the IO tower. However, HABs are more likely to occur in shallow, sheltered areas away from the IO tower. Concentrations of cyanobacteria and cyanotoxins originating from these areas could slowly mix in the epilimnion in the main body of the reservoir, but would be greatly diluted, and cyanotoxins could degrade before reaching the IO tower. Next slide, please. Another concern raised by protestants was that HAB management measures would be ineffective at controlling cyanobacteria and cyanotoxin concentrations reaching the delta. However, there are several reasons the effect of any HABs in Sites Reservoir on concentrations in the Sacramento River would be limited. Each of these is discussed in more detail in the subsequent slides. Next slide, please. HABs would be monitored and managed as part of the RMP. The purpose of the RMP is to protect water quality in Sites Reservoir and its releases through monitoring and management actions. It is a living document that will be modified as needed to incorporate agency input and new information. RMP guidance for HABs includes water quality monitoring, signage, use of the IO tower, and other management measures. Next slide, please. One component of cyanobacteria and cyanotoxin management in releases from Sites Reservoir would be selective use of ports at 7 different tier elevations on the IO tower, as well as the low-level intake. This figure shows the water surface elevation versus storage curve for Sites Reservoir in relation to the elevations of the center lines of the port openings on the IO tower and the low-level intake. Sorry for the poor color selection for the IO tower elevations, but I think you can tell those gray lines apart from the grid lines. Next slide, please. In general, the flexibility offered by the multiple IO tower tiers and low-level intake will make it possible to control the quality of water released from the reservoir. If cyanobacteria and cyanotoxins are not present near the IO tower, releases through the upper higher elevation ports might be preferable because local rice growers would prefer water temperature equal to or warmer than 65 degrees Fahrenheit, and some metal concentrations might be higher at the bottom of the reservoir. Next slide, please. If cyanobacteria and cyanotoxins are present near the IO tower, however, it could be preferable to release water from deeper in the reservoir where concentrations of cyanobacteria and cyanotoxins would be lower. Under most storage conditions, it is likely that ports at an intermediate elevation could provide suitable water quality. If HABs are near the IO tower under conditions of lower storage, however, it may be necessary to take additional measures, such as those suggested in the RMP, to limit release of cyanobacteria and cyanotoxins, as I'll discuss on the next slide. So next slide, please. Several HABs management measures could be taken within site's reservoir to reduce HABs and the release of cyanobacteria and cyanotoxins. These include hypolimnetic oxygenation, flocculants, algicides, and a barrier curtain. These are more likely to be effective at lower reservoir storage. Next slide, please. Any cyanobacteria or cyanotoxins released from site's reservoir would be diluted in the Sacramento River. Model results for the FEIR EIS indicate that when sites releases water to the Sacramento River, the contribution of site's water to Sacramento flow would generally be low, with an average value of 6%, 90th percentile value of 14%, and maximum value of 19%, noting that this maximum value would be very rare. Site's reservoir water would be even further diluted downstream, where the Feather River and American River join the Sacramento River. Next slide, please. Management of HABs would be adaptive and improve with time. Decisions about what port or ports to use in the IO tower may be made on a case-by-case basis and would depend on water quality measurements and the level of concern for particular constituents. The RMP currently does not specify what actions should be taken in all scenarios. Specificity in the RMP will likely increase with time, and the RMP would evolve to incorporate new information regarding HABs management approaches, regulations, reservoir water quality measurements, possibly water quality modeling, and lessons learned. Next slide, please. Another concern raised by protestants was that reduction in winter and spring flows in the Sacramento River could increase HABs in the Delta. This is unlikely for the following reasons. HABs occur in the Delta even after very high flows, once conditions are suitable. So high flows do not prevent HABs. The Sacramento River contributes little to flushing stagnant Delta channels. So high flows in the Sacramento River have little ability to scour stagnant areas in the Delta. Cyanobacteria emergence from sediment and reproduction is low during winter and early spring due to cool water temperatures, which means that high Sacramento River flows would not be washing away cyanobacteria in the water column at that time. Decreases in flow associated with diversion to site storage would be relatively small compared to total river flow, especially in May and June of critical dry and below normal water year types. No literature shows a statistically significant effect of winter or early spring Sacramento River flows on Delta HABs. And lastly, sites releases would cause increases in Sacramento River flow and Delta exports at the time of year when conditions are more suitable for growth of cyanobacteria, which potentially could slightly reduce Delta HABs. Next slide, please. An additional concern raised by protestants was that site's reservoir could contribute cyanobacteria inoculum to the Delta. This is unlikely for a couple reasons. First, any cyanobacteria released to the Sacramento River would not be expected to experience substantial growth because high water velocity, colder temperatures, and turbulence in the river would not be conducive to cyanobacterial growth. In the Delta, locations that have suitable habitat for cyanobacteria already have a large number of cyanobacteria seeds in the sediment and a large influx of cyanobacteria from other regions in the Delta. A small increase in inoculum from sites reservoir is unlikely to be biologically meaningful given the resident population of cyanobacteria. Next slide, please. This evaluation of HAB-related concerns focused on nutrient and hydrodynamic processes expected in sites reservoir, controls on the release of cyanobacteria and cyanotoxins from sites reservoir, and processes affecting delta HABs. While HABs are an issue of concern and the exact future concentrations of cyanobacteria and cyanotoxins are unknown, because of the reasons described in this testimony, it is my opinion that releases from sites reservoir would be unlikely to cause unreasonable adverse effects in the Sacramento River and Delta associated with cyanobacteria or cyanotoxins. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you,
Great.
Ms. Huber. Then with
Yeah, before we proceed to cross-examination, I just wanted to have Ms. Arishas briefly explain her role in the preparation of Ms. Huber's testimony. It might be helpful for the record. Ms. Arishas, would you mind just briefly explaining your role? And
Yes, my role was primarily to help Anne with literature review for exhibits or citations that were included in her testimony. Specifically, I worked primarily on the sections in her testimony having to do with cyanobacteria and their location, potential location in the reservoir, in sites reservoir, as well as effectiveness of management measures. Those were the primary focus of my help.
okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. And if I'll look to the team, can we get our Dr. Winslow pinned up here with us? And then Mr. Busher, I see you are off mute, so I'll ask you first, do you have questions for this panel?
I do. Yes.
It looks like we need I don't know who you plan to start with. There we go. There's Mr. Winslow. Dr. Winslow, excuse me. Go ahead, Mr. Busher.
So most of my questions are going to be for Ms. Huber. I'll have a few questions for Dr. Winslow at the end. Ms. Huber, we met several months back. My name's Eric Busher. I'm the managing attorney at San Francisco Baykeeper, one of the protesting parties in this matter. I want to thank you again for your time and for being here to answer questions. And if we could pull up Ms. Huber's testimony, written testimony, cites 337, please. I want to start with paragraph 5 at the top of page 3. In this paragraph is kind of a synopsis of your conclusions for the rebuttal testimony. Can you explain what an unreasonable adverse effects means in this context?
It means increases in cyanobacteria and or cyanotoxins would not substantially change water quality in a way that would cause a notable effect on beneficial uses.
Okay. You
I know
agree that there
it's
are
hard because there are no regulatory guidelines for this.
and fair enough, I'll get to that in a few minutes here. You agree that there are current excuse me. You agree that there are current adverse effects from harmful algal blooms in the Delta now,
Yes,
and that those impact beneficial uses?
yes,
Does increasing the pollution in an already polluted water body constitute an adverse impact in your mind?
Objection vague and lacks foundation.
I'm going to allow the question.
you.
Go ahead, Ms. Huber.
Well, in this case, what I'm saying is that there would be no to minimal increase. There's the delta has any volume of water has a limited capacity to support a bloom. So if there's a bloom already occurring in an area and you add cyanobacteria to it, it's not like you'll end up with a bigger bloom. The bloom will reach its maximum sort of regardless. It's a little different than, adding cyanobacteria is a little different than adding, pesticides. And
Okay.
what I'm saying is that there won't be many added anyways.
So I appreciate your opinion. I want to try and separate two things, right? One is whether adding cyanobacteria to the delta would be an adverse effect from whether sites reservoir will cause that to happen. So do you agree that adding cyanobacteria to the delta would be an adverse effect?
Adding high concentrations of cyanobacteria to the delta would be an adverse effect.
Okay. And in your answer a minute ago, you described that there's a capacity for a water body to I don't know, support a harmful algal bloom. Is the delta currently maxed out in that regard?
Objection vague.
Sustained.
Is the delta at the capacity of the water body to support harmful algal blooms currently?
I guess I would describe it this way, is that when conditions are suitable for cyanobacterial growth, there's enough seeds, there are a lot of seeds in the sediment ready to form a bloom. So when conditions are suitable, a bloom will form, and it will grow until it either is washed away or uses up its nutrients or something else ends it. So is it at capacity? I would say it's close. It's a little hard to be specific there.
Do you have an opinion as to whether it is likely that harmful algal blooms in the delta will become either larger or more frequent in the future?
They may, when it gets warmer due to climate change, they may start earlier or extend later in the year.
Under appropriate environmental conditions, there's the capacity in the delta for more algal blooms in the future.
Objection vague as to delta. I mean, I think we need to be specific about a location or certain areas of the delta.
Well, I mean, if I'm looking at paragraph 5 here, right, based on information about halves that already occur in the delta, right? That was her opinion. That's what I think I'm entitled to ask about.
Well, I would say that warmer temperatures will allow cyanobacteria to start blooming earlier in the year and later in the year. So more, yes, more. I wouldn't necessarily say more locations, just more through time.
Thank you. Can we scroll up to the bottom of the prior page and look at paragraph 4, please? You say here that there are no federal or state regulatory standards and that you can't do a quantitative evaluation of water quality exceedances for cyanobacteria. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes.
Okay. And can we look at page 34 then, which is table 1 that's cited here? So on the left half of this table, there are recreational standards that you've identified related to cyanobacteria concentrations, correct?
Yes.
And those are primarily numeric standards, correct?
Yeah, and there's a wide range of values.
Correct. And there are also on the right half of the table drinking water concentration standards that you've identified, correct?
Yes.
Is it possible to assess whether the criteria for the recreational standards would be exceeded in Sites Reservoir?
Not quantitatively, because we don't know what those concentrations will be. I would say, based on the FER EIS assessment, there may be locations in Sites Reservoir that do trigger, say, signage for recreation.
And when you say trigger the signage, that would exceed these standards?
Well, I would say at least we don't know it for sure, but maybe the 0.8 micrograms per liter or higher. And this is, well, just based on an estimate of what could happen in Sites Reservoir.
Have you?
At certain, I would add at certain locations in Sites Reservoir.
Have you modeled expected concentrations of cyanobacteria, or you are the authority to your knowledge, concentrations of cyanobacteria in the reservoir?
No, and that's because it's, even if you have, an existing reservoir with lots of data, it's difficult to model harmful algal blooms. And to then try to do that at a reservoir that doesn't exist yet with, no data for accurate parameterization and calibration, that would be very speculative.
And thank you. If we could go back then to page 3 of Ms. Huber's testimony. In paragraph 7, if we could scroll down just a little bit, you say nutrient concentrations are likely to be lower than those in the delta. Are you referring to nutrient concentrations within the reservoir?
Yes.
And what do you mean by places in the delta or other locations with elevated cyanobacteria?
Well, if you look at the figures that are at the bottom of my presentation, my testimony, sorry. Sorry, Ms. Mullen, if you could scroll down to the bottom of the testimony. I compared the nutrient concentrations at the intakes, the possible intake locations, that's Red Bluff and Hamilton City, to nutrient concentrations on known locations with known cyanobacteria, cyanotoxin problems, and that's the Klamath River, the delta at the Banks pumping plant, and the canal below Gianelli pumping plant, which is at the San Luis Reservoir, and the San Joaquin River at Vernalis, which represents the inflow to the southern delta. So the question is, where are there problematic HABs? I would say the Klamath River, San Luis Reservoir, and spots throughout the delta.
Do those spots throughout the delta overlap with any of the locations in figure 1?
Yes, I would say the Banks pumping plant represents water coming out of the southern delta. And I will note that I chose locations where there was good quantity of data. So it's not like it's a lot of data for every spot in the delta.
And if we could go back then to paragraph 7 on page 3, am I right to take the end of your or the end of this paragraph as opining that there would be fewer or smaller HABs within sites reservoir than at places where we know HABs exist in the delta?
Yes.
And is it correct that the well, I'll strike that. What do you mean by less severe or in this context?
Well, and again, we haven't done quantitative modeling, so I would say that it means occurring in smaller areas or shorter amount of time, or not reaching the same density of cyanobacteria. I mean, basically, cyanobacteria need nutrients, and if there are fewer nutrients, then you're less likely to get a big bloom.
But to the extent that there are blooms in the reservoir, are you opining that they would be safer to recreate near those blooms than it would be to recreate in areas in the delta where there are blooms?
And it all depends on the concentration of cyanobacteria and cyanotoxins. So if it were the same, then you'd have the same danger.
So you say they're going to be less severe. I mean, do you think it would be safe to let dogs swim in the reservoir when there are these less severe blooms?
Objection, babe. Lacks foundation.
I mean, I agree less severe is a little bit vague, but that's not my term.
I would say that as acknowledged in the FEIRES, there are some, it's possible that at sometimes and locations, there might be a concern for exposure of recreationalists to algal blooms.
We could go to page 4, please, paragraph 10. Can you define the term stratified reservoir for me?
It means the bottom of the reservoir is colder than the top of the reservoir. And typically the reservoir is divided into a hypolimnion where water temperature is sort of uniformly cool. And then there's a metalimnion where there's a temperature gradient. And then the epilimnion where water temperature is just generally warmer. And it limits the top to bottom motion of the water.
Okay. And you say that under conditions of low oxygen at the bottom of some stratified reservoirs, why some or what proportion of those?
Oh, wait, let me just read what the whole sentence, where is it? Okay, I'm not finding the sentence, but I think what you're talking about is that what I'm trying to say is that low oxygen does not occur at every stratified reservoir, at the bottom of every stratified reservoir. But it's not unusual.
Okay, so I take it your opinion is Sites Reservoir you expect to be a stratified reservoir with those kind of 3 layers of temperature, correct?
Yes.
Do you expect Sites Reservoir to be one of the some stratified reservoirs in line 7 where conditions of low oxygen would exist at the bottom?
I don't know for sure, but I would assume so.
We scroll down to paragraph 12, please, at the bottom of this page. So I just want to make sure I understand the term correctly. I take your description of evapoconcentration to be that it increases as conditions get warmer and drier and there's less inflow into the reservoir. Is that a fair characterization?
It sort of depends on whether you're talking about, there are 2 things. One is the rate, which is like in terms of feet per year, versus the effect on the concentration of constituents in the reservoir. So, so evaporation is the rate, but evapoconcentration is the effect on concentration of constituents in the reservoir. And so you're saying, does it increase if evaporation increases, then yes, evapoconcentration increases. And, warmth and warm weather does increase evaporation. And as far as less inflow to the reservoir, what really matters is the reservoir volume. So it depends on reservoir operations. Bigger volume means less evapoconcentration.
You say at lines 23 and 24 that Sites Reservoir releases would not be made during the period of peak evapoconcentration in the calcium modeling. Is that correct?
Yes.
And that's because in line 25, the volume of water in the reservoir was below operational dead pool, correct?
Yes.
And am I correct in understanding that this analysis is presented in the final EIR that you cite here, AHO 73?
Yes, that's correct.
So, Ms. Mullen, could we pull up AHO 73, please? And if we could go to page 35, please. And scroll down to the bottom half. And Ms. Huber, this is the section of the final EIR on evapoconcentration you're referring to, correct? And the following couple pages.
Yes.
The first paragraph here describes how the analysis was performed, kind of the assumptions, correct?
Right. I think so. Yeah. It was based on the calcium water balance.
And this analysis was used for just a hypothetical constituent, correct?
Yes.
Would you expect that the results of the analysis would be reliable for predicting how nutrients, how evapoconcentration would impact nutrients in the reservoir?
Well, in my testimony, I try to make the point that the nutrient processes within the reservoir are going to have a bigger effect on changes, on concentrations than evapoconcentration. So, like when a bloom occurs, they tend to deplete either nitrogen or phosphorus.
So I understand that. I think I was trying to ask a different question. I apologize. Just for this piece of the analysis, the evapoconcentration.
Yeah, if you assume that, say, nitrogen is a conservative constituent in the reservoir, then I would say, yeah, this applies.
Okay, and would it apply for metals in the reservoir?
Yes.
Okay. And would it apply?
I mean, like, it applies to anything that is like, well, even with metals, there's some settling out of suspended sediment that would, but if we're assuming a conservative constituent that doesn't settle out, that isn't affected by cyanobacterial growth, then yes, it applies.
Okay. Would this hypothetical constituent analysis apply to cyanobacteria itself?
No. No, I think the cyanobacteria are driven by suitable conditions and nutrients. And it occurs on their blooms occur on a sort of shorter time span than the evapoconcentration.
Thank you. And then, what are we here? 3 lines from the bottom of that first paragraph of this section. The sentence that reads, "This constituent was assumed to mix thoroughly through the reservoir." Do you see that?
Yeah, well, you said 3 lines from. From the, yeah. Yes, I see it.
Is that kind of thorough mixing that is assumed consistent with a stratified reservoir?
No, I mean, so this is like a basic analysis to understand evapoconcentration, but like I was saying, there are a lot of caveats, and that you're pointing out one of them. Generally, concentrations tend to be higher at the bottom of the reservoir.
If we could then scroll to page 36 of this document and look at figure 6-2A. So, Ms. Huber, am I correct in understanding that this is the calcium modeling results of the evapoconcentration analysis we've been talking about?
Well, it's the evapoconcentration analysis that is based on the calcium water balance. So calcium doesn't calculate this.
Thank you. Okay. And you say in your testimony, there were no discharges during the peak concentration period, and that's the first half of the 1930s, correct?
Yes.
And can we go down to the next figure on the following page? And this is zoomed in on that 1930s decade, showing that peak analysis, correct?
Yes.
And then this also adds the storage of the reservoir on the right-hand y-axis, correct?
Yes.
If we could go then back up to figure 6-2A. So it looks to me like there are around 1977 and then 1991 or so are the next two highest peaks in this results. Do you see those?
Yeah.
Do you know what the storage level in the reservoir was during those, I don't know, smaller peaks?
No, not off the top of my head. I would need to look at results.
Do you know if it was above or below Deadpool?
I am unsure.
So there may have been discharges during those two periods, the 1977-ish and 1991-ish times.
Objection lacks foundation. Assumes facts, not an evidence.
Mr. Busher, can you say the question again, please?
Is it correct that there may have been discharges during the 1977 and 1991 peaks represented on this graph?
Well, like I said, I don't recall whether the reservoir went below Deadpool during those times, so I am unsure. I think I would like to look at a time series.
Me too.
Yeah.
Did you or are you aware of, well, let me ask it this way. In your work, either in this proceeding or as part of the final EIR, did you zoom in on any other time periods other than the one peak in the early 1930s that is in the next table or the next figure?
I don't recall zooming in. I think we were really focused on that early period because it does show such a large increase.
All right. Thank you. We can go back to Ms. Huber's testimony. And here, still page 4. So the last line here on page 4 in line 28, you say average evapoconcentration was estimated at 16%. Is that the... Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, so that means, like, if you assume that the concentration of something going into the reservoir is 100, that due to evapoconcentration, on average, the concentration in the reservoir would be 116.
So that's within the reservoir.
Yes.
Did you do any comparison between the evapoconcentration, right, at a specific time and the times of releases from the site's reservoir?
Well, I would say that evapoconcentration effects were part of the metals analysis. So we compared estimated metal concentrations in the reservoir to the range of values measured in the Sacramento River at the times of releases.
Okay. Do you know what the average evapo concentration was during times of releases for the reservoir?
Objection overbroad, beg.
Well, and I do want to point out that evapo concentration is something that happens over time. It takes quite a while to, so it doesn't like fluctuate a lot. What causes fluctuation is, say, the inflow of fresh water, or the total reservoir volume. I think the answer to your question is no. I didn't specifically look at that, except that for the metals analysis, it was month by month. So we had evapo concentration effects for each month and compared it, estimated concentration at the time of release to the concentration in the river. Although my rebuttal testimony is really about HABs.
And then in lines 25 through 28, the sentence that starts a high end at the end of line 25.
Yes.
Do you know when in the time series that 90th percentile value was that you're referring to?
Well, we could look at that graph that we were looking at before and see all the points where the concentration was 123.
And is the description here, right? It's described as a value for evapo concentration of water released. Fair to say that that would be, well, is that different than the average evapo concentration?
No, but as you pointed out, there's a top to bottom difference. So again, this evapo concentration evaluation is, a sort of general tool for assessing changes that might be related to evaporation.
Okay. Thank you. Can we go to the next page, paragraph 13, please? The header here, is this, do I interpret that correctly as things that may limit nutrient concentrations in sites reservoir?
And also cyanobacterial use of the nutrients.
You say in line 11, concentrations at the surface may become depleted. Is it more likely than not that those concentrations become depleted?
That's hard to say. If the bloom is disrupted, say due to wind, then it might not become depleted. But if the bloom continues unabated, then yes, they would become, either nitrogen or phosphorus would become depleted.
So the bigger the cyanobacteria bloom, the more likely it becomes that those nutrients or one of those nutrients becomes depleted.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't necessarily say you need a big bloom. You just need a bloom that's not ended prematurely by something else. Like, so if you don't have a lot of nutrients to begin with, you wouldn't necessarily end up with a large bloom because the bloom would run out of fuel, before becoming really big.
In lines 13 through 15, you make a comparison between Sites Reservoir and much of the delta. Can you estimate for me the depth of Sites Reservoir?
Oh, it varies with time, of course. And I'm not having that number at my fingertips. Well, let's just say it's variable. Kyle could probably tell you.
And fair enough, I understand it's variable. I guess I meant when it is full, and I don't know whether page 38 of your report will help answer this question or not.
Page 38 of my
Figure 5, the last page. It at least has elevation in feet plotted out. I don't know whether it encompasses
yeah,
the entire
that's a good
reservoir.
point. Yeah, so let's say the bottom is at 300 feet. And I'm looking at it now. At 1,500,000 acre feet, it looks like elevation is about 510. So let's say more than 200 feet deep.
That's close enough for my purposes. Thank you. I appreciate that. How deep is the water in the area you refer to as much of the delta?
Well, the area of concern is where HABs form. So I guess I wouldn't be so concerned about, say, main stem Sacramento River. And I'm not going to be able to tell you exactly what the average depth of the delta is. I know there's some channels that are quite shallow, like parts of Old River and Middle River can be, well, of course, it varies tidally by like about 6 feet. So, yeah, you want me to say, like, I don't know, between 2 feet and 40 feet.
Thank you. In your rebuttal testimony, do you have I'll strike that. I'll move on. Can we go down to page 6, the top portion?
And maybe Mr. Busher is, I just want to get a quick time check. I'm thinking about a break here.
I think I've got a couple questions about this paragraph, and then I think a break would be great. I don't know. I think I'm going to be longer than I thought yesterday.
And that's, we do happen to have time, but go ahead if you would like to get through this paragraph, and then we'll take a brief break.
Thank you. So under the block quote here, and this is a paragraph about nitrogen fixation primarily, if you look at the bottom of the prior page. You say, if HABs form in Sites Reservoir, do you have an opinion as to whether it is more likely than not that HABs will form in Sites Reservoir?
I think it's likely that there will be some HABs in the reservoir in some locations.
Okay. And then you continue, you say they could eventually deplete nutrient supplies. Do you have an opinion as to whether it is more likely than not that they would, in fact, deplete nutrient supplies when they formed?
Probably.
Okay. And then you say that either nitrogen or phosphorus concentrations could become limiting in line 9. Do you have an opinion as to whether one of those is more likely than the other?
Well, my testimony has an evaluation of the ratio of nitrate to total phosphorus, and it's sort of in the range where it could be either. I think it may, actually, it's likely that it could vary by time of year. Yeah, so I guess I don't have an opinion about that.
And other than depletion through the formation of HABs, are there other things that would cause those concentrations to become limiting?
Well, there are other types of phytoplankton that could use nutrients, and aquatic vegetation also use nutrients. And there could be some settling of nutrients.
Thanks. I think we're at a good place to take a break if you want to do that.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Busher. Let's go ahead and take 10 minutes. We'll come back at 10:53.
Thanks.
Reporter, are you ready for us to go back on the record?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, I see we have Ms. Huber, we have Mr. Busher, and we have Mr. Ferguson. So back to you, Mr. Busher.
Thank you. Ms. Mullen, if we could put Ms. Huber's testimony back on the screen and go down to page 8, please.
Mr. Bush, before we proceed, can we just confirm Ms. Orishas is available? I don't see.
Ms. Orishas, are you with us?
Yeah, I'm trying.
Oh.
It shows that my video is on, but
As long as you can hear us.
I can hear you. I'm sorry. I'll work on the video.
Okay, thank you.
And if we could scroll down just a little bit so we can see paragraph 24, please. Ms. Huber, do you agree that flow in the Sacramento River and the Delta is important in limiting harmful algal blooms in the month of June?
Did flow in the Sacramento River in June?
And the Delta, I mean, primarily the
And
Delta.
the Delta, I would say that the most important thing is flow, net flow through channels that may become stagnant.
And is that also true in May?
Less important in May because temperature is often not warm enough.
What about April?
Not generally, I would say probably not in April.
You indicated earlier this morning that HABs may form earlier or last longer into the year as a result of climate change. Is that correct?
Yes.
And if that were to occur, would that also push earlier in the year those months where flow is important in regulating or controlling HABs in the Delta?
If air temperatures under climate change became, say, so warm as to allow HABs to form in April, which I don't know how extreme that would be. Just say if, then I would say at that time, net flow through stagnant channels is important. Noting that there are always tidal flows going on.
So you agree that there are some years where HABs are present in the Delta in June, correct?
Yes.
And please correct this if it's wrong. I think we talked about it the last time you were here. The reason we call them a harmful algal bloom is because the growth of the cyanobacteria has become excessive. Is that fair?
The main reason they're harmful is because of the cyanotoxins they can produce.
Is there a certain threshold as where a bloom of cyanobacteria transitions from just a bloom into a harmful one?
There's no set rigid threshold. If you have a bigger bloom, you're more likely to get cyanotoxins or higher levels of cyanotoxins.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Do you have an estimate for how long that process takes? I mean, to go from the seed to a large bloom that has high levels of cyanotoxins in the delta?
I don't have a good number for that. In general, cyanobacteria blooms are not present until June. And the rate of their growth depends a lot on temperature. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Okay. And if I'm going to take a hypothetical large harmful algal bloom in the delta in June, do you think it's likely that the growth started in May?
I don't know, possibly.
Do you think it's possible it would start in April?
No. Well, so in general, the blooms start from seeds in the sediment. The sediment and the temperature needs to be warm enough for those seeds to come out. So if you get a few seeds emerging early, they may be inconsequential if later on, when it's warmer, you have a whole bunch of seeds emerging from the sediment. Yeah, so I don't think April's important.
Okay, thank you. Could we scroll down to paragraph 26, please? The bottom of this page and top of the next one. The paragraph begins with a note about the uncertainty of nutrient concentrations in sites releases. How broad is that uncertainty? I mean, like orders of magnitude uncertain or just impossible to predict? What do you mean by uncertain?
Well, it will depend on time of year, because when there's winter destratification, then you're likely to get more nutrients in the epilimnion. And it will depend on what ports are used in the IO tower. So it could be an order of magnitude if, say, cyanobacteria or any phytoplankton use up nutrients in the surface, then there could be almost no, say, nitrate in the releases. Whereas if you pull water from the hypolimnion, it could be higher.
The last line of page 8 and the first line of page 9, there's a sentence that starts nutrients in the water column. Do you see that?
Yes.
So you say they may go up for one reason and they may go down for another reason. Do you have an opinion as to the net impact between those two?
It depends on what nutrient you're talking about. Yeah, I think the net would be fairly close to zero. And yeah, the reservoir is likely to reach a sort of equilibrium with those inputs and outputs. And yeah, so at that point, the net would be zero.
Okay, thank you. Can we scroll down to paragraph 28, the bottom of page 9, please? So when we were talking about the effect of flow in the delta, you emphasized, right, the kind of lower flow channels are the most important places to be able to flush out HABs or prevent HABs from occurring. How does that relate to delta inflow?
It depends on what inflow location you're talking about.
So go ahead, I'm sorry.
So like the San Joaquin River provides flow to the southern delta, and that water can move through a lot of different channels depending on barrier position. And it's maybe more likely to affect lower flow channels than the Sacramento River flow.
Okay. So for the increase in delta inflow from the Sacramento River referred to at the start of paragraph 28, would you expect that to materially impact flows in these lower flow channels that you're referring to?
If the water is exported, it could move into the southern delta and increase flows in fairly stagnant channels. If it goes to outflow, there could be a little effect, but I wouldn't expect it to be as great. And I will say that these changes in flows are not going to have a huge effect. You know, the increases in flow from the Sacramento River and exports could have an effect, but it would be small.
Okay. I'm going to go down to line 21. You illustrate a hypothetical scenario. So the one of the assumptions of this hypothetical scenario is that Sites Reservoir is contributing 14% of the Sacramento River flow, which you described as the 90th percentile value. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then the other part, or one other part, is that the nitrate concentrations were twice as high as the inflow concentrations. And you note that that would not be expected on average, correct?
Yes.
Do you know what percentile that represents, the twice as high as inflow concentration represents?
And now, like I said, it will be fluctuating, but I can't give you a percentile on that.
Am I correct in understanding that at a time where Sites Reservoir is contributing at the 90th percentile value of the river flow, that is likely a time of low river flows drought period?
Yeah. I mean, not necessarily, but in general, that could be true.
Okay. And those hotter drought periods, are those also times where concentrations in Sites Reservoir are expected to be higher than average?
Concentrations of nitrate?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Well, like I said, I don't think evapoconcentration plays a big role in the concentrations of nitrate, so I would say not necessarily.
Okay. I think that's all I've got on this paragraph. If we could go down to page 11, please. And Ms. Huber, this is in the section on comparison with the San Luis Reservoir. And if we could look at paragraph 33. In line 9, you describe a large reservoir such as Sites is San Luis Reservoir also a large reservoir in your mind?
Yes, but it doesn't have the stratification.
And then you indicate that, right, lack of stratification may indicate inhospitable conditions for HABs and help control them. And having stratification may also limit and control HABs. Again, can we weigh whether one is, more effective than the other or has a bigger impact than the other?
I think the stable stratification is more helpful. So I am listing one possible benefit of the turbulent conditions in San Luis Reservoir, but that those turbulent conditions also help bring nutrients from the sediment to the surface. Yeah, and it also helps cyanobacteria seeds from it helps them emerge from the sediment. So on the whole, I think the stratification in Sites Reservoir would be beneficial compared to the turbulence going on in San Luis Reservoir.
Thank you. We can scroll down to paragraph 34. At lines 19 through 21, there's a sentence starting while stratification. Do you have an opinion as to whether increases in ammonia and phosphorus or reductions in nitrogen concentration, as you describe them here, are more likely than not to occur at Sites Reservoir?
At the bottom of the reservoir under anoxic conditions. And we talked about earlier, I'm assuming those would form, but I don't know for sure. And the stratification would keep those nutrients at the bottom of the reservoir.
I just want to make sure I understood that. So it is, in your view, it is more likely than not that there would be increases of ammonia and phosphorus at the bottom of Sites Reservoir. Is that correct?
Yes.
And more likely than not that there would be reductions in nitrogen concentration at the bottom of Sites Reservoir, correct?
Yes.
We go down to paragraph 36, please, on page 12. You identify some caveats halfway through the paragraph, starting at line 19, associated with the temperature information for San Luis and Red Bluff, I believe. Does your analysis account for the caveat B of a small amount of warming between the point of diversion and Sites Reservoir?
Well, it accounts for it in the sense that it's insignificant. This relates to Dr. Winslow's testimony.
Yeah, let me try and ask that differently then. For the temperature data from the CDEC station at Red Bluff, did you adjust that data at all based on Dr. Winslow's rebuttal testimony?
No, and like he was showing, there's little effect during the peak months of inflow to the reservoir.
Okay, I just want to understand the caveat and whether you took any action.
No adjustment was made.
And then the caveat C at lines 23 and 24, you note that some of the values associated with the pumping plant at San Luis Reservoir represent temperature of water released rather than what enters the reservoir. I guess my first question, how many is some?
It varies with the time of year. And I would note that to the degree that there's any top to bottom difference in temperature at Gianelli, the temperatures coming out of the reservoir would be expected to be lower than what's going in the reservoir. But like I said previously, there's not a lot of top to bottom difference. And yeah, in the summer, there's more water coming out than going in.
Can we scroll down to paragraph 37, please? Lines 10 through 12, you state that it is unlikely that blooms would occur throughout the entire reservoir. Does that mean all at once, or that there are certain places in the reservoir where it's just unlikely that a bloom would ever occur?
Both, I think. Yeah.
Okay. And then you note that it's unlikely that cyanobacteria would be equally distributed throughout the reservoir when blooms are present. Can you explain what that means?
Well, so blooms are more likely to occur in shallow sheltered areas. So their concentrations are going to be highest in those areas. Now there's a certain amount of movement of water in and out of, well, through, throughout the reservoir. So there will be small amounts of, in that case, cyanobacteria going from the high concentration areas into, say, the main body of the reservoir, but it would be a lower concentration.
Okay, thank you. Can we scroll down to paragraph 38, please? The parenthetical on line 22, you refer to stratified reservoirs that do not have full lateral mixing. Can you define lateral mixing for me?
Well, mixing from side to side.
As distinct from the vertical mixing that we've been talking about with respect to stratification.
Yes.
Does sites have full lateral mixing as you're using the term, or would you expect it to?
I would expect it to, see, I'm just reading whatever. I would expect that it would not have full lateral mixing because there are some areas of coves, you know, yeah.
Do you have a sense of how many of these various areas, we can start coves or bays, would be present within the reservoir?
Well, we could look at a map of the reservoir and count them, but it's pretty hard to say, oh, this cove is you know, not sheltered enough, so it doesn't count. Yeah, so I couldn't say at this point how many coves might be more susceptible to HABs.
Do you have any estimate for that? I mean, right, 250.
Well, it also depends on your scale. Like if you're looking at an area of the reservoir that has a lot of little curves in it. You know, do you say, oh, that's one big cove, or is it two little coves? So
I'm just trying to get a sense of the scope of places where this full lateral mixing may not occur that would be at higher risk of harmful algal blooms or nutrient buildup.
yeah, if we looked at a map, I could show you like which areas might be more susceptible, but you want a number, I could say, I don't know. Well, I don't really know, maybe 10. So yeah. I think this is one thing where it's hard to say in advance what will happen. Where would HABs form?
Let me try this way. Are there places within Sites Reservoir where you would not expect any HABs to ever form?
I would say there are areas where they are much less likely to form. I know for sure they won't occur in all places, no.
And how extensive are those low likelihood areas? 10% of the reservoir, 60% of the reservoir?
Most of the main body of the reservoir, so over 60% of the reservoir.
Thank you. And looking at the beginning of paragraph 39, so if blooms occur outside of these kind of sheltered, protected areas, they could be somewhat disrupted by turbulence.
Yes.
Do you have an opinion about whether it is more likely than not that any such HABs would be disrupted?
Well, there are actually multiple reasons why coves would be better habitat, and wind is one of the reasons that HABs are less likely in the main body of the reservoir. Sorry, and you asked how likely it is that they will be disrupted by wind. I would say disruption is not an either or thing. It can slow down the growth of a bloom without terminating the bloom, which is apparent in St. Louis Reservoir.
Can wind or wind-driven turbulence also move around blooms without terminating them?
There's a difference between turbulence, like at one location that can turn up the surface, versus wind that would move water from one side of a reservoir to another. Like, so the local turbulence is common, but it's not like you can move all the water from one side of a reservoir to another. It does help with this dispersion, but it won't like move a bloom en masse to another location. Also, if the blooms are occurring in the shallow coves and bays where they're more likely, they will likely be sheltered from the wind and not be likely to be moved.
And if we could scroll down to the rest of paragraph 39 on the following page, is it fair to say, Ms. Huber, that those more sheltered coves, shallow coves, tend to be near the shoreline?
Yes.
And then at the end of paragraph 39, you indicate that wind and wave movement can also affect the location of cyanobacteria and concentrate HABs near the shoreline, correct?
Yes, but I'm not talking about movement from one side of the lake to the other.
Certainly. Do you agree that the presence of HABs along the shoreline will impact recreational beneficial uses of the reservoir?
Yeah, if they form there, yes. If at high enough concentrations, yes.
And then up on line 3 of this paragraph, you say it is expected that wind effects at sites may be similar to other large reservoirs in the Sacramento Valley. What other reservoirs are you referring to?
Shasta, Oroville, Berryessa, Folsom.
Okay, thank you.
Actually, I think, yeah, sites may be better stratified than Folsom, but anyways.
Can we scroll down to the bottom of page 14 and the top of page 15? Can you define half-life for me, please?
Means that it's the amount of time that it takes for half of the, in this case, microcystin to degrade.
And so at the longer end of the spectrum identified in line 1 of page 15, it means half of the toxin would still exist 2 weeks later. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then a quarter of the original toxin would still exist 4 weeks later?
Assuming that the half-life is consistent through time. Yeah.
Well, I'll ask you,
meaning
the half-life
that,
consistent through time?
But I mean, well, there's an initial half-life. How long does it take for half to go away? Once half have gone away, then it's possible that the amount of time for an additional half to go away could be different than the first half, if you see what I mean.
I understand. Does that apply to microcystin?
I would say that the degradation of microcystin is variable. So yeah, I wouldn't necessarily expect some exact number to continue through time. But yeah, as indicated, most of the degradation could occur in the first few days.
Can we scroll down a little bit so we can see for paragraph 42, please? Thank you very much. What do you mean by multiple days in the first sentence here?
Oh, well, it depends on many factors, but an example is given in the second half of the paragraph. So in the example, it's 25 days.
Is there a range?
Oh, yes. Well, of course there would be a range. It would depend on the location of the bloom and the port that's used on the IO tower and the distance between the bloom and the IO tower.
And does the distance of the bloom to the tower, the lateral distance, impact that as well?
Yes.
So do you have a sense for the range of the time for that lateral travel to occur from wherever the bloom is to the IO tower?
Well, it would vary depending on the location of the bloom.
Well, I agree. I appreciate that. I mean, I'm just trying to understand, right? We have a half-life of between 0.2 and 14 days. I'm trying to figure out where that lateral time fits in within that half-life. If you have an estimate for me, I'd appreciate it. If you have to guess, I don't want you to guess. So
Yeah, I would say if you look at the shape of the reservoir, most of the coves are like not on the east side of the reservoir. So they would, blooms and coves would have to travel across the reservoir some variable distance. And it's not just the lateral distance that matters. It's, the depth of the epilymnion. And like I said, the port on the IO tower. So no, I don't have a range of values.
scroll down to paragraph 43, please. At lines 16 through 19, you identify both selective use of multiple tiers in the IO tower and then several other management measures that could be used. Do you know whether any of those management measures in lines 18 and 19 will be used?
I think they will be used if necessary.
Do you think it is? Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
They are all mentioned in the reservoir management plan.
As possible tools.
Yes.
When you say they will, you think they will be used if necessary. Do you have an opinion as to whether it is more likely than not that any of those tools will become necessary?
I imagine that, yeah, and I should change that necessary to necessary or substantially helpful. I imagine that at least one of them will be used.
As part of the management measures that could be used include efforts to prevent harmful algal blooms from appearing, right, or traveling to areas near the IO tower?
Yes.
And
I would say algicides, maybe in that case. They could be used for spot treatment.
are algicides effective for spot treatment in the shallow cove areas that we discussed as well?
Possibly. Maybe flocculants too.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, maybe what too?
Oh, flocculants.
Thank.
Can we scroll down to paragraph 46, please, the following page? You describe the effectiveness of the IO tower being at its greatest when storage is moderate to high. What do you mean by moderate to high?
Well, it depends on the conditions in the reservoir, and an example that I gave, I think in the next, well, somewhere, it was about 200,000 acre feet. Yeah, it depends on the actual concentrations of the various constituents.
So is moderate to high storage something greater than 200,000 acre feet in the reservoir?
In the example I provided, yes.
So I'm asking as a general matter, right? When is you say it is most effective during times of moderate to high storage. What's that range of acre feet?
Yeah, so in the example, like I said, it depends on what constituents are a concern and what their values are, and the top versus bottom of the reservoir. And in the example I provided, it was like 200,000 acre feet up to 1,500,000 acre feet.
We go to page 38 of the declaration. Look at figure 5. So am I right to understand that there are 8 different places where water can be drawn from the reservoir? Or 8 different depths?
Yes.
And the bottom one, the orange line, is below that line what you described earlier as dead pool, operational dead pool?
It's pretty close.
And the example you gave when I asked about what is a moderate to high storage amount was 200,000 acre feet. That would allow for 1, 2, 3 potential intakes. Is that correct?
Yeah, but if the reservoir is at 200,000 acre feet, withdrawals would probably not be made from that port that's at 370 feet. It would be that port at 340 feet would be the target one.
Am I correct?
The bottom one would still be available, but the low level intake would be available. But ideally that one would not be used.
Okay, so that was going to be my question. My understanding was that for reasons aside from nutrients or HABs, the authority would, all else being equal, prefer not to use the low level intake. Is that fair?
Yes.
And like you indicated, at 200,000 square feet, the intake at 370 odd feet may not be usable. It'd be at the very, very top of the water level in the reservoir, correct?
Right.
And so just having one intake available at 340 feet elevation is sufficient to provide the greatest control or the greatest benefit from the IO tower?
Well, it's about 30 feet below the surface, so that's we don't know for sure, but that's likely deep enough to avoid high concentrations of cyanotoxins or cyanobacteria should they be present.
Okay, so do I understand your opinion then being that the effectiveness of the IO tower depends on being able to use an intake that is more than 30 feet below the surface, but not the low level one?
Not necessarily. Sometimes the epilimion is much shallower, which means cyanobacteria and cyanotoxins, if present, would be in a shallower layer. So not necessarily 30 feet might not be necessary.
Okay. Can we go back to page 16, please? Again, on paragraph 46, do you have an opinion or an estimate for how often conditions in the reservoir would be consistent with your description as storage being moderate to high?
Well, like I said, the threshold would vary depending on concentrations. But the reservoir is below 200,000 acre feet about 15% of the time.
About 15%. Thank you. Can we scroll down to paragraph 48, please? Ms. Huber, you mentioned a minute ago that there's a range of depths that cyanobacteria can survive or exist in the water column up to, give or take, 30 feet or 10 meters. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you reference lines 25 through 27, studies in the Deepwater Ship Channel and the Stockton Turning Basin. Are those stagnant bodies of water?
Definitely the Turning Basin.
What about
Stockton Deepwater Ship Channel, not, well, it sort of, yeah, there's no precise threshold of what stagnant is compared to not stagnant. So compared to some other channels in the Delta, I would say the ship channel is less stagnant.
How about compared to sites?
Well, there would be, yeah, it's not easy to make a comparison. There would be more wind. Well, no, wind might, yeah, I don't know what the wind difference is between the sites reservoir and the Deepwater Ship Channel. What goes on in the Deepwater Ship Channel is that it may not necessarily be good habitat for HABs. It is near the turning basin, so some of the HABs in the ship channel may be emanating from the turning basin or other stagnant areas. So I'm not sure how fruitful it is to compare the two.
Okay. Can we scroll down to page 19, please? At the bottom of paragraph 54, and kind of generally throughout this section, I have a question about the RMP. But you refer to new information being collected. Is that new information about reservoir operations itself or conditions?
All sorts of new information, like do HABs form? Where do they form? Yeah, in reservoir operation, we have a better handle now on reservoir operations than HABs processes.
And I guess, will the RMP start to, right, take actions, make decisions, et cetera, prior to the reservoir being, right, constructed and filled?
Yes. I mean, I think the RMP that we know from the FEIR EIS will be modified probably before operations start. But there's some information that won't be available until the reservoir exists.
Can you go to page 21, please? And scroll down to paragraph 62, please. You say at line 18 that there could be other actions that could be tested at sites reservoir in the future. Are any of those actions identified as of yet?
In the RMP, no.
Anywhere else that you're aware of with respect to sites?
With respect to sites, no. Yeah, I mean, the RMP is meant to evolve. So if information comes out that a new procedure is really good at managing HABs, then that's could be tested.
But there's no specific procedures or investigations or science that sites currently contemplates doing that you describe as, right, new technology or evolving technology, anything like that?
Not that I'm aware of.
Thank you. We go to the following page, 22, the top of the page. So you say at lines 2 through 3 that modeling might eventually become a useful tool in predicting HAB formation. I take it to mean that you don't think modeling is currently particularly useful in that regard?
Not well.
Yeah, objection. Vague.
Oh.
Mr. Busher, can you try the question maybe a slightly different way?
Sure. Do you think that current cyanobacteria and cyanotoxin modeling is a useful tool in predicting HAB formation and movement?
Well, like I said earlier, I think you need a lot of data to thoroughly parameterize a model and evaluate it, compare it to measurements to have an accurate model. And I think even when you have a lot of data, it's hard. There's not a lot of success in modeling HABs.
Do you have any opinion as to when that modeling information and analysis may be a useful tool for the site's reservoir?
Well, the reservoir would need to exist, and there would need to be quite a substantial amount of data collection.
And when you say a substantial amount, is that like a year's worth, a decade's worth?
Multiple years. And if HABs don't form, well, yeah, it just depends. But
can we scroll down to page 23, please? I guess that's the next one. The last bullet point here that is contained within paragraph 66, you say increases in delta inflow, outflow, and exports could slightly reduce HABs in the delta in the July to November time period. Do you have an opinion as to whether it is more likely than not that those things will reduce HABs in the delta?
I, I would say it's primarily the exports that could have that effect, but it would be small.
So the exports may have some small effect. Is that fair?
Yeah, because sites is not going to be increasing San Joaquin River flow. And because a lot of the Sacramento River water will either go to outflow or exports, I think it's the export portion that is more likely to affect flows in stagnant channels. But I would not make a claim for a big improvement.
Please scroll down just a couple of lines here in paragraph 67. You talk about the locations in the delta not being likely influenced by changes in Sacramento River flow. To your knowledge, are there locations in the delta where HABs are relatively common that are influenced by Sacramento River flow?
No, unless the flows are exported.
Okay.
There are some areas where they are HABs form, but I wouldn't call them common.
Okay. Can we go down to paragraph 68, please? The bottom of this page and the top of the next one. So you cite to this Lehman et al. 2020 study, and conclude that you quote as concluding that microcystis blooms are established in the estuary and persist despite flushing from extreme wet conditions like water year 2017, correct?
Yes.
Do you agree that stream flow is more important than nutrient concentrations in the upper San Francisco Bay estuary in terms of controlling microcystis growth?
There's more than one way to answer that. I think nutrients currently are not limiting blooms in the delta. They might limit the magnitude of the blooms. So if you're asking about controlling whether a bloom happens or not, then I would say flow through stagnant channels is more important than nutrients.
And is it correct that the paper Layman 2020 also concluded that flow was important in the amplitude of microcystis blooms in the upper San Francisco estuary?
Wait, sorry, say that again. That flow was important in controlling the amplitude.
Correct.
Well, the winter flows did not prevent blooms from forming. And I think relatively poor conditions for blooms continued, beyond spring into the beginning of the summer in that year, associated with higher flows throughout the delta and lower water temperature.
So let me ask this way. I take the conclusion that you've quoted here at lines 1 through 4 of page 24 to be that flow cannot completely flush or eliminate microcystis seeding or blooms from the delta. Is that fair?
Yeah, and this is specifically focused on like flushing seeds. Like the seeds remain, there are enough seeds so that when conditions become suitable again, the blooms can form.
Correct. But the paper does not conclude that flows at other times of year, right, those non-winter flushing flows have no impact on the abundance or extent of harmful algal blooms in the delta, correct?
Yes, correct.
And you indicated during, I think, your presentation this morning that generally high water velocity, turbulence in the river, and colder water are not conducive to cyanobacteria growth. Is that fair?
Yes.
And those would be things, all three of those would be things that would be associated with greater flows, correct?
Yes.
We could go down to, what is this, page 25, and I've got maybe 3 more minutes of questions, so hopefully we can get through this before we take a lunch break. This is perfect. Thank you, Ms. Mullen. You cite this Spear 2013 study and then suggest that it's kind of based on an anecdotal comparison of 2 years. Do you find that study useful or reliable in some way?
Yeah, well, that information about cyanotoxin levels in the deep water ship channel came from this document. The goal of the document wasn't to compare wet springs and dry springs. But this was one side item that was in that document. Which I think it's not indicative of any effect of changes in Sacramento River flow in the spring that might affect HABs. It's not a statistical comparison, and it was in an area that's affected primarily by the San Joaquin River,
okay,
not the Sacramento River.
That's helpful. So you're not relying on this to assert that higher spring flows in the Sacramento River would increase HABs in the delta.
I don't think anyone's saying higher flows in the Sacramento River would increase HABs. You mean decrease?
Well, so
yeah.
Line 5, right? Or 4 and 5, you say one study suggests that higher spring flows might have contributed to a large bloom. And I hear your can appreciate your clarification about San Joaquin versus Sacramento River, and that's not the question you were asking. I just want to make sure that you're not offering an opinion that higher spring flows in the Sacramento River would increase HABs in the Delta.
Yeah, I see this sentence is confusing. What I was trying to say is that higher spring flows would have, let's see, contributed to less cyanobacteria rather than more. Regardless, I did not rely on this paper to make conclusions about spring flows.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Please scroll down to paragraph 73, please. You note here, well, I just have a question. You refer to summer months of critically dry water years in this paragraph. Is that also the time when concentrations of nutrients and cyanobacteria would be the highest in Sites Reservoir due to evapoconcentration?
Oh, wait, let me orient myself here. So can you please repeat your question?
Yeah. So you're talking about increases to flows at Freeport in these summer months of critically dry years that occur. My question is just in that same time period, is that also the time when concentrations for nutrients or cyanobacteria would be highest in Sites Reservoir due to evapoconcentration?
Well, like I said, the important question is what is coming out of Sites Reservoir. That's one item. The cyanobacteria might be limited to coves. For nutrients, the change in concentration is something that takes many months. It's not like evaporation in 1 month is going to produce the concentration that you see in that month. It takes, yeah, multiple months.
Okay. And can we go down to paragraph 77, please? At lines 15 and 16, you say delta effects would be minimal because the delta is already replete with cyanobacteria.
Yes, and this is specifically regarding the inoculum issue.
Would increases in cyanobacteria or inoculum from Sites Reservoir make it more difficult to ultimately reduce or eliminate HABs in the delta?
I think if HABs in the delta can be controlled, that it would be easier to control HABs in Sites Reservoir. If there were 0 HABs in the delta, then there might be more of an issue, but I don't see that happening.
So because the water quality already limits enjoyment of recreational beneficial uses, any impacts on those recreational beneficial uses are reasonable in your mind?
Objection, lacks foundation.
Try it.
I'll lay a foundation. That's fair.
Impact's not in evidence. Yeah.
Fair enough. I'll lay a foundation. Ms. Huber, do you believe that currently HABs in the delta impact the ability of people to enjoy recreational beneficial uses?
Yes, at times. And I don't think that sites will cause a change in that.
So is it because those uses are already limited? Is it your opinion that any increase in cyanobacteria from sites is reasonable?
Objection, Beg, overbroad. With respect to certain beneficial uses,
I think there's a shared understanding. Go ahead, Ms. Huber.
Well, first, I think the concentration of cyanobacteria and cyanotoxins coming out of sites reservoir will be low compared to what's in the delta, and they would not cause like a notable increase that would cause additional effects to beneficial uses.
You agree that the amount of HABs coming out of sites reservoir is going to be higher than the levels of cyanobacteria in the Sacramento River absent the existence of sites reservoir?
Not well, potentially, occasionally, because I think there are like not many cyanobacteria in the Sacramento River, but it would be small change.
And so your opinion is that small increase or change in the amount of cyanobacteria that enters the delta is reasonable because the beneficial recreational uses are already impacted by HABs, correct?
Well, it's because it would not change the beneficial uses.
Because they are already impacted, correct?
Well, because HABs are already in the delta. Let me put it that way.
I don't think we need to go any farther. That's all the questions I have for Ms. Huber. I've got a few questions for Dr. Winslow. I'm happy to take a lunch break or spend 10 or 15 minutes with him. I'll defer to the group.
Unless there's another counter proposal, I think it would make sense to take a lunch break. It's not as if we're going to get through this panel before lunch, so we might as well go ahead and take a lunch break and return at 1 o'clock. But are there any, before we do that, are there any procedural comments or issues we should address? All right, we will log you out of the Zoom. Please log back in and I'll see you at 1 o'clock. Thank you.